This video is sponsored by Wondrium. When William Marshal died in the year 1219, he was the most powerful and most highly respected man in the Kingdom of England. He was the Earl of Pembroke, the regent for the young Henry III, and had recently defeated a great rebellion of English lords and thrown back a devastating invasion by the French. The young king owed William Marshal his kingdom, and all England owed him the hard-won peace. Upon his death, the Archbishop Stephen Langton called him the greatest knight in the world. But he was not given these great honours. He won them by his great deeds and his many virtues. He began his life as the second son of a minor noble, destined to inherit nothing of value. It was his talent as a knight on the battlefield and as a tournament champion that won him renown and riches through hundreds of victories. And for 51 years he loyally served King Henry II, his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, their sons Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, and King John, and their grandson Henry III. But was he really such a peerless warrior and paragon of chivalry? Or was he also a cunning politician who expertly negotiated the ebb and flow of the dynastic royal family for his own ends? This is the incredible story of William Marshal. In 1152, during the siege of Newbury Castle, King Stephen of England ordered the execution of William Marshal. William had committed no crime, but he had been given over to the king as hostage to ensure his father's obedience to the crown. But that father broke his word. The king commanded that William be taken to the gibbet and strung up. William was 5 years old. As the young boy was led from the siege works to the scaffold by the king's soldiers, oblivious that he was going to his death, he passed by the Earl of Arundel, who was holding a handsome javelin. With boyish excitement, the lad said, "Let me have a go at that spear, sir." King Stephen heard the boy's innocent glee, and his heart was overcome with compassion. He scooped up the child and said that he was reprieved, and they all went back to continue the siege. This was a period of civil war in England, named by later historians as the Anarchy, and the stakes could not have been higher. King Stephen was at war with the Empress Matilda, and as both were grandchildren of William the Conqueror, both had a claim to the throne of England. Matilda's lineage was stronger, as she was the daughter of Henry I, the former king, who had explicitly nominated her as his heir, while Stephen was merely the son of the Conqueror's daughter, Adela. On the other hand, Matilda was a woman, while Stephen was a man. The lords of the realm supported one claimant over the other, some switching allegiance during the conflict, and many using the situation to better their own positions. One of these lords, one of middling rank, was John Marshal, whose lands centred on the West Country. During the reign of Henry I, John had gradually accumulated land, wealth and status. He eventually purchased for himself a position at court called the Master Marshalsea. It cost him 40 silver marks, a huge sum, especially considering the position alone would bring no greater power or income by itself. What it did do, however, was give him an official place at the court and responsibilities over 4 under-marshals, a group of royal ushers, the keeper of the king's tents, and the supervisor of the royal fireplaces. It was certainly not the most prestigious position, but it did give him a certain amount of access to the king and to the leading barons. After Henry I's death in late 1135, Stephen acted swiftly to take the crown of England for himself, and John Marshal offered the new king his full support. This loyalty earned John a position as custodian of the royal castle at Marlborough. But as Stephen showed himself to be a rather soft king, support for Matilda grew, and John Marshal switched his allegiance. During the Civil War, John Marshal showed himself to be an excellent soldier and a skillful politician. He was also quite cunning and brutal, using the conflict to better himself as much as he could. Late in the conflict, he had his marriage annulled so that he could marry a new woman called Sybil, the sister of the Earl of Salisbury. John and Sybil would have 7 children together, the second of which, born in about 1147, was William. His early childhood was likely spent at the family estate at Hampstead Marshall, which included a Motte and Bailey castle. No doubt he saw little of his father, who was occupied in furthering his interests wherever possible. But John overstepped the mark when he built a new Motte and Bailey castle near his estate at Newbury. King Stephen attacked it in full force, and John could not hope to resist. The terms of John's surrender included giving over his second son William as hostage. But the ruthless John Marshal had no intention of making peace. His handing over of the 5-year-old William was merely a trick to buy him more time to fight, and he was perfectly willing to let the king kill the boy. There is a famous line in the medieval biography of William Marshal, where John declares that he didn't care about his son, for he still had the anvil and hammer to forge yet better ones. On the face of it, this was an extraordinary attitude, but perhaps John was making a calculated risk. Everyone knew that King Stephen was a soft touch. His weakness in failing to punish those who rose against him was one of the very reasons for the long conflict, and it may be that John believed Stephen could never have killed a little boy. Still, after being saved from hanging, the lad was later led to a catapult. They threatened to load the boy into it and fling him at the castle. When this didn't move the defenders, they suggested using him as a human shield in an assault on the walls. That didn't transpire either, though. He was thus saved from death and continued as a hostage for months, perhaps more than a year. But these events may have been William Marshal's first memories. Certainly he remembered the stories and recounted them to his friends and sons later in life. He didn't appear to hold any of this against his father, and in fact seems to have admired him as an ambitious, shrewd warlord. But perhaps his father's actions towards his king and his son also had some impact on William's lifelong perception of the virtue of unwavering loyalty. The years following William's release from captivity passed in relative peace. King Stephen died in 1154, when William was about 7 years old, and Henry II, son of Empress Matilda, ascended the throne as King of England. Henry II would go on to be one of England's greatest kings, and William Marshal would be closely tied to him and his line for the rest of his life. During Henry's early reign, William the Boy grew into a fine young man. The history of William Marshal says, quote, "In a few short years, young William grew into such a fine figure of a man that no sculptor could have created one so perfect in every limb. I saw it with my own eyes, and remember it well. Such fair feet and hands, but they were as nothing compared with the rest of his handsome body. Anyone who beheld his shapely, upright figure would have declared, if he had any judgment, that there was none more finely built in the whole wide world. His hair was brown, his complexion good and swarthy, and his bearing was worthy of an emperor of Rome, with a fine broad stride, and as impressively tall in stature as any noble man could wish." End quote. This young fellow may have possessed a fine physique, but as the second son of a relatively minor noble, he had little in the way of prospects. His older brother John would inherit everything from their father, the family lands and wealth and the office of Master Marshal, while William would get nothing but his name. In about 1160, when he was 13 years old, William was sent to Normandy to serve in the household of the Baron William of Tankerville, a kinsman of William's mother Sybil. He was sent off with little fanfare other than his weeping mother and siblings, and only a single servant to accompany him. His father was not there to see him off. During his life, William would cross the English Channel dozens of times, but no doubt this first crossing was one of the most memorable. He was going to the land of his ancestors, but England was all he had known, and at the Norman castle of Tankerville, on the banks of the Seine, he would be instructed in the business of being a knight, and he would learn his business as well or better than any man ever did. The Lord of Tankerville maintained a powerful retinue of household knights sworn to him in service, and William received his knightly education amongst them for about 6 or 7 years. His medieval biographer amusingly claims the young William was both lazy and greedy. He went to bed early, slept late, and ate too much. A typical teenager, really. His education included reading and writing, in French at least, and he was never very skilled in Latin, and other aristocratic pursuits like hunting, dancing, singing, and chess. But he took little interest in these things. His real passion was in the rigorous military training that formed the core of his life. For years he learned and excelled in horsemanship, the use of weapons, and armoured combat. In 1166, when William was around 20 years old, he reached the end of his training and was knighted by his lord in a brief ceremony at Neuchâtel in northeast Normandy. It was a hurried affair because they were on the way to battle. The lords of Normandy had moved to the border to defend the duchy from their neighbours in the counties of Flanders, Ponthieu and Boulogne. While at Neuchâtel, Tankerville discovered his position was soon to be attacked, and so gathered his retinue of 28 knights, including the newly dubbed William, and hurried to intercept the attack at a bridge on the outskirts of the town. As a newly knighted young man about to engage in his first real fight, William was in a state of high excitement. As the retinue reached the bridge, William pushed his horse to the front. He was commanded in no uncertain terms to stay back and to not be so presumptuous. For a moment he was crestfallen and ashamed. He let 3 knights pass him, but it was not in his nature to be anywhere but the front, and so he spurred his horse forward until he was at the very head of the party crossing the bridge. His biographer tells the story like this, quote, "And on they rode, till they saw the enemy right before them, advancing in great numbers. They went to meet them, and as the 2 forces closed, they sent their horses charging forward. With shields braced and lances levelled, they struck each other with their utmost might, piercing and shattering shields, smashing and splintering their lances, and battering each other with the stumps. So loud was the clashing din of their blows, that it would have drowned God's thunder. You'd have heard the echoing clang and ring of helmets battered down to the chainmail hoods. And William Marshal made a valiant show indeed. His lance broken, he drew his sword at once, and plunged into the fray. No one seeing him would have thought him a novice in arms. He dealt and received so many blows before he was done, he'd no intention of leaving till he'd shown what he could do. Many found him a fearful foe, as he cut through the press with awesome blows. So awesome indeed, and dealt with such force, that many gave way before him, terrified." End quote. The battle continued to ebb and flow, but Tankerville's knights were driven back by the arrival of more enemy riders. Near the end of the battle, William was wounded by men wielding an iron hook, leaving a long-lasting scar on his shoulder from where they tried to bring him down from his horse. That horse was also gravely injured and would soon die of its wounds. The biographer assures us that all agreed young William had fought better than anyone else on either side that day. It sounds too good to be true, of course, because how could a young man in his first battle outfight so many veterans? Lest we doubt the story, he says, quote, "I tell you no word of a lie. It was well known and reported. The fact is that with the marshal's help, the men of the town managed to outfight their attackers." End quote. The biographer might be exaggerating, but then again, William did become the greatest tournament knight of his generation, perhaps the greatest ever. So it is entirely possible, or even likely, that he was the most skilled as well as the most motivated knight on the field that day. However, although William bested many wealthy men, he did not have the wisdom to take any of them prisoner. Thus, unable to ransom those knights, he remained impoverished. Not only was he now without a warhorse, he did not have the funds to replace it. What was more, the border conflict soon fizzled out, and peace returned to Normandy. So Tankerville reduced the number of knights in his retinue, and William found himself let go. With no lord, he now had no home, no money, and no real prospects. An impoverished knight with no master was a dishonourable state to be in, and perhaps he considered returning home to England. His father John Marshal had died in 1165, and William's older brother John had inherited the Marshal lands and the position of Marshal. As the younger brother, William could have asked for a position in the new Marshal's household. It would have been a comfortable existence, coming at the cost of living in his brother's shadow. William, though, was never interested in taking the easy path. He sold the cloak he had been awarded by Tankerville at his knighting for the sum of 22 shillings, and with the money he bought a palfrey for himself and a pack horse to carry his belongings. With his arms and armour packed on the old nag, he set out to seek his fortune. A tournament north of Le Mans had been announced, and William made his way there, as did any knight seeking renown. Indeed, the Lord of Tankerville also attended with his remaining knights, and William was allowed to tag along. However, he was ashamed to have to fight in the tourney without a warhorse. Riding a palfrey would have been an enormous disadvantage for the young knight, and perhaps to avoid his embarrassment, Tankerville granted young William the use of a destrier. This particular horse was unwanted by anyone else because it was so wild that it was almost uncontrollable, and William must have doubted his chances in the coming tourney. These 12th century tournaments were not like the jousts we tend to see in TV and movies that are from later eras. Tourneys were more like mock battles, fought by teams of knights who ranged over a wide area, and wounds and broken bones were common, while deaths were also known. The game was intended to be training for real warfare, but it was also a chance for knights to win glory outside of war. The other great reward was wealth, won through defeating other knights and taking them prisoner. The captive was expected to pay a ransom for his release, usually in cash, and might also hand over their horse, arms and armour. Of course, the risks too were not only physical but financial, and being defeated would cost the man dearly. The two sides, of dozens and sometimes hundreds of knights, would line up on opposite sides of a large field. When the signal was given, they would charge into a great clash. After the first stages of the battle, the fighting would break up into smaller contingents, ranging across miles of countryside until sundown. And William's first tournament was a success, taking 2 very valuable prisoners. The first he battered to the ground with a lance, and the second he seized by taking his horse's bridle and dragging him away before overpowering him. A remarkable display of daring and horsemanship in the midst of the melee, especially considering he had such a difficult horse of his own to handle. And in fact, this would go on to become William's signature move. His skill and bravery that day set him on the path to financial success. He won not only cash, but 4 war horses, along with other horses and a fine array of gear, and his new wealth transformed his status as a knight. Immediately, Tankerville and his retinue treated William with new respect, because material wealth, especially that won in combat, demonstrates a man's inner virtue. As William's biographer says, "How much you've got is how much you're worth, and how much we care about you." William at once set off for a new tournament to be held just 3 days later, riding day and night to make it in time. He performed so valiantly there that he was declared outright winner of the tournament. And for the next year or more, he had a career as a famed tournament knight, travelling to every land where a knight should wish to win renown. Quote, "Through France, the Low Countries, Hainaut and Flanders, word of his deeds resounded. Every worthy man in Brittany and Normandy sang his praises. His valour was known to all in Anjou, Maine and the Duchy of Aquitaine." End quote. Having won at least some fame and wealth, in late 1167 he elected to return home to England, for it was the land of his birth and he wanted to see his good kinsman. He had not been home for 8 years, but was returning as a man of some reputation and independent means, and soon he would be going to war. Instead of looking for a position in his brother's household, William instead found service in that of his maternal uncle Patrick, the Earl of Salisbury. He was a noble of the first rank, and Salisbury was soon called by King Henry II to support a campaign in Aquitaine. So William had made the correct choice, as he was about to be drawn into the circle of the royal family, where he would stay, more or less, for the rest of his life. There was rebellion in Aquitaine, and lords in neighbouring regions defied Henry II's authority. In Poitou, the ambitious Lusignan family, led by Geoffrey and his younger brother Guy, were raiding around Poitiers, and the king retaliated with raids on Lusignan lands. William's experience of combat thus far had been a skirmish between knights and the chivalrous pageantry of tournaments. Now he would see a different kind of warfare. As castles were nigh on impregnable without long and expensive sieges, the best way to hurt an enemy was through brutal sorties into his lands, burning crops and villages and taking whatever plunder you could carry off. The immediate victims were ordinary people, but this kind of destruction would also damage the economic base of the lords who ruled over them. In this case, it took about a month for Geoffrey and Guy de Lusignan to submit to Henry, at which point the king left for the north to barter peace with King Louis of France. He left his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine behind in Poitiers to look after things, with the Earl of Salisbury as her lieutenant. In 1168, William was part of Salisbury's retinue guarding Eleanor as she travelled through the countryside in Poitiers on the way back to Poitiers. As the country had been supposedly pacified, there were few guards and they rode without armour. Without warning, the party was ambushed by Geoffrey and Guy de Lusignan. Eleanor was sent on down the road, while the Earl of Salisbury and his men turned to hold off the attack. While most of the knights were shrugging on their armour, the Earl changed from his riding horse to his war horse, but was killed as he climbed into the saddle by a lance driven into his back. Important men like Salisbury were usually taken hostage, as they were far more valuable alive than dead. It was a shocking moment, and the knights of both sides were astonished. The biography tells us what happened next. Quote, "Seeing his uncle mortally stricken, the Marshal was almost crazed with grief that he hadn't been able to stop his killer. He was desperate to take revenge. Not waiting to arm fully, clad only in a hauberk, he rode straight to the attack. Clutching a lance, he dealt with the first he met, sending him crashing to the ground. Burning to avenge his uncle, no ravening lion was ever so savage with its prey. Indeed, anyone who got in his way, he put to a painful, dismal end. He would have avenged the Earl indeed, if he hadn't run into their lances and had his horse killed beneath him. But being unsaddled didn't slow him down. He could see no possible way of escape. A band of more than 60 attacked him all together, all bent on overwhelming him and taking him captive. But he showed not the slightest sign of fear. Setting his back to a hedge, so that he had only to defend the front, he cried, "Anyone who fancies testing his strength, step forward." All of them strove with might and main to kill or capture him, but he fought back even harder, defending himself with such resolve that he slew 6 of their horses. Confronted by a riotous clamour, the Marshal made a stand like a boar against a pack of hounds. They would never have taken him. They couldn't lay a hand on him, not daring to go near, and he would never have been theirs had it not been for a sly attack. One knight jumped the hedge, and straightaway aimed a spear thrust through it to strike him from behind, sending at least a yard of the shaft clean through his leg." End quote. Gravely wounded, William was taken prisoner. All his hard work and achievements thus far had amounted to little. His uncle, his lord and patron, his highest contact, had been killed before his eyes, and William had failed to save him. William was of little value himself and could expect no special treatment. In fact, his wound was left untreated as he was dragged through the wilds of the countryside behind the roving band of enemy knights. After months of ignominious captivity, he was ransomed by Eleanor of Aquitaine, and he was given a place in the Queen's own retinue. No doubt she was happy to find a place for a skillful and courageous young knight, and of course he was the nephew of the slain Earl of Salisbury. But still, it was quite a turnaround. William served her for the next 2 years in Aquitaine, guarding her as she travelled, and perhaps taking leave to compete in tournaments when he could, as the region was gradually pacified once again. William accompanied Eleanor back to England in 1170 to attend the coronation of her son Henry. Henry II was still very much alive, but he chose to have his eldest son Henry, at just 15 years old, crowned king along with him. The heir was tall and handsome, with broad shoulders, pale freckled cheeks, piercing blue eyes and golden red hair. Henry II had spent his adult life steadily accumulating lands, what today is often called the Angevin Empire, and he knew that without a clear succession in place, they would all fall into anarchy on his eventual death, just as England had with the death of Henry I. The king intended that his eldest son would inherit the crown of England and the Duchy of Normandy. His second son Richard would inherit Aquitaine, their mother's homeland, while Geoffrey was heir to Brittany. Poor John, the youngest, would get nothing of note, although he was only about 2 years old when all this was decided. Perhaps thanks to Eleanor's suggestion, Henry II now chose William Marshal to be the young king's tutor-in-arms and a leading member of his retinue. It was an enormously significant appointment. He may have been the junior partner, but the young Henry had been crowned a King of England, and William was given the great honour of guiding him in matters of arms. William was about 23 years old, and for the next 10 years and more, William Marshal and Henry the young king would be inseparable companions. Quote, "Thanks to his guidance and instruction, the young king grew in honour, nobility and esteem. Prowess was his constant companion, and in view of his many virtues, he was deemed the finest of all princes on earth, Christian and Saracen alike." End quote. But the young king was in a difficult position. He had a grand title and some responsibilities, but no freedom and no money of his own. His father would not share power, and the son grew increasingly frustrated, his anger encouraged by his father-in-law, King Louis VII of France. And in 1173, matters came to a head at a great family meeting when the young king demanded the old king give up either Anjou, Normandy or England to his eldest son's rule. King Henry refused, and young Henry fled, now in open rebellion against his father, taking many of his loyal retainers with him. Some of the lords and knights in the young king's household refused outright or turned back, but a handful stayed with him as he ran for the protection of his father-in-law, the King of France. These few swore a new oath of allegiance to the rebellious son. The 5 leading knights in the young king's household were declared traitors to the crown. William Marshal had spent years carefully furthering his interests, and the most sensible course of action would have been to return to King Henry II, distancing himself from the ungrateful son. But William instead chose to renew his oath of loyalty to his lord over his king and to follow his friend into rebellion. Young Henry's brothers Richard and Geoffrey joined him in rebellion, as did their mother Eleanor. In Paris, the eldest son was proclaimed the new King of England, and he set about gathering powerful allies by promising rich rewards. Insurrections began from the Scottish border to Aquitaine. Throughout the conflict, William remained loyal to young Henry. Some have suggested the Marshal had always been an agent of Eleanor, placed in the young king's household explicitly to influence him for his mother's ends, namely this rebellion. We don't know one way or the other, but to me that seems out of character, considering his actions throughout his life. The biography tells us that during the war, it was William Marshal who had the great honour of knighting the young king. This is especially notable considering William had no great title or land, and so, if it's true, it is a sign of the high regard he was held in. The young king invaded Normandy, and King Louis took his army further to the south, but the attacks soon faltered. An invasion of England was planned, and an advance guard landed in East Anglia and captured Norwich, while Henry II rushed back to his kingdom to put down local rebellions. When William of Scotland was captured in the north, the rebel invasion was cancelled. Instead, a fresh invasion of Normandy was launched, but Henry II returned and put a stop to that as well. The rebellion ran out of steam, and the young king made peace on his father's terms. His sons and their supporters, William Marshal included, were forgiven. His wife Eleanor, however, was not, and she would spend the next 10 years and more in captivity. The young king, tamed, was sent to Poitou to assist his brother Richard fight the ongoing unrest in and around Aquitaine. But from around 1176, it seems he ultimately turned away from the affairs of state and toward the pomp and chivalry of the tournament. For the next few years, William and the young king travelled the tournament circuit, and it was William, now aged about 30, whose reputation and wealth was transformed by his remarkable successes. When he was an old man, he claimed that in tournaments he had defeated an astonishing 500 knights. Initially, he fought along with Henry as part of a team who travelled and fought together. But by the late 1170s, William's reputation and skill had grown so much that he began to attend events on his own. He was exceptionally skilled as a horseman and immensely accurate and powerful when delivering crushing blows with his weapons. He was also famously able to take an incredible beating himself, resisting blows that would have felled other men. And he was a cunning tactician, making correct split-second decisions in the heat of combat. In other words, he had all the attributes necessary to be a great champion. He was a once-in-a-generation talent. He did not only win fame and glory, but this was the period when he became immensely wealthy. These riches were the worldly display of his inner virtue, but his financial success also elevated him socially, despite his lack of land and title. So much so that he even established his own retinue. Still loyally serving the young king, William Marshal was able to raise his own banner and to fund men-at-arms to fight under it. His coat of arms, the red lion rampant against the green and gold field, remains famous even today. William and the young king were close friends, companions and brothers-in-arms for around 12 years, but in 1182 a terrible rumour reached Henry's ears. William Marshal was accused of bedding Henry's wife, Queen Marguerite. According to the biography, this was a baseless accusation by 5 jealous knights in the king's household. They also claimed that the Marshal was acting above his station, stealing the young king's limelight and usurping his honour, as well as doing it to the Queen. Henry seems to have doubted these rumours enough to publicly ignore them. However, his demeanour became extremely cold towards William, and William in turn withdrew from his lord's company, not coming anywhere near him. Surely, if the accusations of adultery had been true, then William's punishment would have been immediate and swift. But perhaps there was something to the accusations of arrogance. Matters came to a head at Christmas 1182 when, in front of a busy court, William asked for the chance to prove his innocence through trial by combat. He offered to fight 3 opponents, one after the other, and if bested, he would go to the gallows. But Henry coldly refused. Their rift seemed irreconcilable, and William was in effect banished from the household. So in early 1183 he found himself a free agent once more, without a lord to serve. A bidding war soon broke out, with counts and dukes offering him huge sums and offers of marriage to win his service. It is likely he entered the household of the Count of Flanders for a short time, so that he could fight on the Count's tournament team. But it wasn't long before the message came that the scandalous charges had been found false, and William was asked to return to the young king. Henry needed William's help, because he was in open conflict with his brother Richard, and once more the family was at war. However, a true disaster would soon strike. By the end of May, the young king fell ill with a fever, and then he contracted dysentery. After days of battling the illness, he died on 11th of June, 1183. He was 28 years old. On his deathbed, the young king asked William to fulfill the vow the young king had made a few months earlier to take up the cross and to undertake a crusade to the Holy Land. Even after the terrible falling out the two had recently suffered, William swore that he would. This is a great example of putting honour and loyalty above personal advantage. William, now masterless again, would have had his pick of great lords offering wealth and even marriage into their families. Instead, with the permission of the devastated Henry II, William left for the Holy Land a few months later to honour the final wishes of his dear friend. Before he went, he returned to his family in England and said farewell, setting his affairs in order on the chance that he was never to return. He then took up the cross and travelled the over 2,000 miles to Jerusalem. During his 2 years in Outremer, he became great friends with the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, in fact, making a secret promise to the Templars. But little else is known of his activities. It was a period of relative calm before the events of 1187 that would lead to the Third Crusade, although the coming storm was already on the horizon. As Saladin continued his preparations for his grand assault on the Christian kingdoms, William Marshal headed back to Normandy, where he met with King Henry II. The king awarded William, now aged almost 40, a place in his household. He had survived countless tournaments, warfare, and a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but now he had to face the cutthroat environment of the court. He had served at the side of the young king for years, and had encountered the intrigues of other knights and lords, but that was nothing like the court of Henry II. Every courtier that surrounded the king sought to further his own interests, while at the same time shifting factions coalesced around the most powerful men. As his career advanced, William took the greatest care to avoid making powerful enemies, and so never fully committed to one side or the other. He became known, even mocked, for his careful equivocation. Through it all, however, he maintained steadfast loyalty to the crown, and his reputation for unfailing fidelity gradually won over the most important figure of all, the king. In 1186, the king granted William his first estate in Lancashire. It was a relatively modest estate, but it brought him an income of £32 a year. He began to build his household and was now emerging as a lord in his own right, a noble of standing in England. At this time, he could have wed a crown ward, the young heiress Eloise of Lancaster, who was given over into his care, but he chose not to. He had far higher aspirations and meant to hold out for a truly grand marriage once he had climbed higher. William's ambitions were well understood by the king. His complaints that he had not yet been properly rewarded for his service were referenced in the letter the king sent to William, instructing him to join the king on campaign in the Duchy of Berry in central France in 1188. The resulting campaign would spiral into a broader rebellion, open war with the heir Richard the Lionheart, and ultimately the death of the king. In 1186, the king's son Geoffrey fell from his horse during a tournament in France and was horrifically trampled by the horses of his own household knights, later dying of his injuries in Paris. This left just Richard, the Duke of Aquitaine, and young John, now in his 20s, vying for the great inheritance, while Henry resisted handing over any more power. He didn't want to crown another son and potentially find himself supplanted. But Richard, by now a seasoned warrior and a powerful lord in his own right, in 1188 decided to force the issue, backed by Philip II, the cunning King of France. Henry II summoned a huge army, including thousands of Welsh mercenaries, and set off to Berry to retake the duchy. William Marshal was promised the great castle of Châteauroux in Berry, with all its lordship and whatever belonged to it, by way of recompense for his efforts in retaking it, and in helping to lead Henry's war. William advised the king to launch a sudden attack so bold, concerted and fierce that it could not be resisted. Taking his advice, that is what the king did, looting and burning a great swathe through the countryside. The marshal was then sent with a detachment on his own chevauchée, the word we use for these raids of devastation, looting, burning and pillaging as they went. This kind of warfare, where the common people suffered terribly, may be utterly immoral to us today, but it's notable that William's biographer considered this to be a great act of chivalry. The reasoning was that this method of warfare would bring the enemy to his knees, and thus the greater good of peace would be restored. In this case, however, though the land was ruined by both sides, the campaigning season ended without any conclusion. The old king retreated and returned to Anjou, his health now starting to fail him. Many of the king's old supporters began to quietly melt away. Not William Marshal, though, who the king came to rely on ever more in military and diplomatic matters. And Henry resolved to reward William's loyalty. The king had promised him Châteauroux if it could be taken, but it remained in French hands. Instead, he offered a far greater prize. This would be the hand of Isabel de Clare, the worthy and beautiful 18-year-old heiress of the late Earl Richard Strongbow. This marriage would bring William lands in England, Wales, Normandy and Ireland, making him at a stroke into one of the greatest barons of England. However, by the start of 1189, William would have well understood that he was now fighting on the losing side. A promise was all very well, but if the king fell, and it looked like he might, then it would come to nothing. Many other men abandoned Henry and extracted promises from Richard and Philip in exchange for their loyalty. but the Marshal remained faithfully by the side of his king. Richard and Philip attacked the king at Le Mans in June. William led the defence of the southern gate, fighting hard against the knights of Richard and Philip. It was a bloody affair, and the defenders could not resist the onslaught. The old king fled for his life, with his household knights forming a bodyguard around him on the road, the enemy in hot pursuit. Just 2 or 3 miles from Le Mans, with the enemy hot on their heels, Marshal and another man reined in and turned to face the approaching knights alone. They meant to risk their own lives to give their king a chance to get just a little further away. William was astonished to find that it was Richard the Lionheart himself bearing down on them at the head of the pack. Immediately, William spurred his horse forward. The greatest tournament knight of his generation raced forward to meet the greatest soldier of his age in single combat. However, it would not be a fair fight. Richard had been so keen to capture his father, he had raced after him without armour, protected only by a light helmet and armed only with a sword. Marshal, on the other hand, carried a lance. "God's legs, Marshal, don't kill me," the Lionheart roared. "I'm unarmed." "No," replied the Marshal, "I won't kill you. I'll leave that to the devil." And he drove his lance clean through Richard's horse, killing it on the spot, and Richard fell with it. It was a fine blow indeed, and it proved the saving of the king. The Lionheart was well aware that Marshal could have killed him but chose not to. This act of chivalry deserved an act of similar generosity in turn, and Richard leapt to his feet and called off the chase. However, the strain of the battle, the flight, and the loss would prove too much for the failing health of the old king. After retreating to the old Angevin stronghold of Chinon, it became clear that Henry was dying. Many of the king's supporters now fled to Richard, while others went back to their own lands, distancing themselves from any retribution that might fall on them. William Marshal, however, stayed resolutely at the king's side. When the great king finally died, frail and broken in his own bed, his household staff immediately looted his corpse, stealing his clothes, jewels and money, as much as each of them could take, leaving the man strewn half out of bed in only his breeches and shirt. Marshal and the remaining household knights rushed to the room and covered their king with a cloak. In the days that followed, William helped carry the king to the nearby abbey, where the body was laid out to await Richard's arrival. Richard the Lionheart would inherit his father's lands and titles, and so could do with the Marshal whatever he wanted. Certainly, William would have expected punishment for recently humiliating the new king. A lesser man, most men, would have fled. However, William Marshal faithfully stood vigil over Henry's body and awaited his fate. When Richard arrived and entered the Abbey church, his face was an emotionless mask. For a long time he stood and looked down at his father, the man he had essentially hounded to death. He had everything he had fought for, but perhaps he now reflected on what it had cost. Eventually, Richard turned from the body and commanded the Marshal to join him outside. "Marshal, my good sir," he said, "the other day you tried to kill me." "Sir," replied the Marshal, "I'd no intention of killing you and didn't try. And if I'd wanted, I'd have buried it in your body as I buried it in your horse. I don't think I was wrong to kill your mount, and I'm not sorry I did." Richard replied, "You're forgiven, Marshal. I shan't hold it against you." "Thank you, my dear lord," the Marshal said. "I have never wished to see you dead." The Marshal had shown unswerving faithfulness, as well as remarkable ability in war and politics, and that was exactly the kind of man that Richard wanted around him. To secure the Marshal's loyalty, Richard confirmed the old king's promise of the hand of Isabel de Clare, which would make William one of the richest men in the kingdom. Marshal was also entrusted with an important mission to return to England at once to take charge of Richard's land and interests. In August 1189, William married Isabel. He was about 43 years old, and though his wife was far younger, it appears to have been a happy marriage. They would have 10 children over the next 20 years, 5 sons and 5 daughters, and as far as we know, William was never unfaithful. The Marshal would be given the great honour of sitting on the Council of Regency that Richard appointed when he left Europe for the Third Crusade. During his absence, there were struggles for power within England amongst the magnates. The most powerful of them was William Longchamp, appointed as Chief Justiciar, who had enormous authority despite being a Norman rather than English. Longchamp clashed with the absent king's brother, and William chose to back John. Ultimately, Longchamp was stripped of his offices and he fled the kingdom. John, however, began exploring ways to assert his own authority over that of the absent king, even seeking to obtain Richard's duchies by allying himself with King Philip II. When Richard was captured on his journey home from the Holy Land, John made a move to seize the throne for himself. William Marshal, true to form, joined the faction that remained loyal to Richard. John found himself in a rather weak military position and eventually agreed to a truce. When in 1194 Richard finally returned from captivity, John's forces surrendered and John gave himself up to his brother's mercy. William Marshal's elder brother John, who William had now overtaken socially and politically, chose the other side and was killed in the fighting. King Richard then granted the hereditary marshalship and the Marshal family lands to the ever-faithful William. For the rest of Richard's reign, Marshal, even though he was in his 50s by now, served Richard during the endless war against King Philip, who sought to take the Lionheart's duchies and counties for himself. When Richard was mortally wounded in the fighting, the king, on his deathbed, commanded that the Marshal take charge of Rouen and the royal treasure. Soon, William would find himself serving yet another king and son of Henry II, but it would not be an easy relationship. The succession was not simple. With the death of the legendary soldier Richard, his enemies descended to seize his lands and war broke out almost everywhere. There were many who argued the heir should be Arthur of Brittany, the son of John's older brother Geoffrey. Arthur went so far as attacking Normandy, and John undertook an incredible forced march, taking their forces by surprise and taking Arthur prisoner. After a year in captivity, Arthur vanished. The rumour was that John had killed him, and perhaps he did. Through it all, William Marshal loyally backed John. However, John was not the soldier that his brother Richard had been, and even with the Marshal's help, he could not hold Normandy against the sustained assault. At the end of 1203, John abandoned Normandy, and William Marshal left with him. William was one of the ambassadors sent to negotiate with Philip. During these negotiations, William paid homage to Philip in exchange for keeping possession of his Norman lands. John was furious, and William found himself distanced from the king for years. John had a nasty habit of treating his nobility with contempt, needlessly alienating many of them throughout his reign and ultimately making life rather difficult for himself. In 1207, John set his sights on Ireland, intending to take control of Irish and Anglo-Norman lands there for the crown. The Marshal had long been furthering his own interests in Ireland, attempting to establish and expand his authority there. This brought him into direct conflict with the interests of John, who recalled William to court, but it was a trap. In John's presence, William was publicly humiliated. Many of the leading men of his household, even his own kinsmen, were given great rewards by the king, removing them from William's influence. And while the king had William with him, his men moved to seize William's lands in Ireland. However, by all accounts, William's wife Isabel and her loyal knights did a great job in defending their territory. John sent word that the three most prominent knights in the household had been summoned to court. It was a sneaky move by John, using his royal command to strip the Marshal dynasty of their most steadfast defenders in Ireland. To refuse a royal summons would be worse than criminal, it would be ruinous to them and their prospects. But William Marshal was a man who valued loyalty, and his lifelong virtues inspired similar feelings in the men who served him. The three knights chose their lord over their king, and the assault on the Marshal lands was defeated. It was one of John's many failures and miscalculations, and he came to a wary compromise with the Marshal. William's second son Richard was given over to John as a hostage. John already had William's firstborn son William in his care. This was done to ensure the Marshal's ongoing loyalty. Spending much of the coming years in Ireland, strengthening his position there, William was summoned to court again in 1213. Things had not been going very well for John. His ill treatment of the Lord of the Realm, combined with his string of military failures and arguments with the Church, had placed him in a fragile position. Enemies within and beyond the kingdom gathered, most sponsored by the cunning King Philip, who dreamed of taking England for himself. William had been treated as badly as anyone by John, but he chose at this time to extend the hand of friendship to the king, somehow marshalling 26 Anglo-Irish barons to renew their oaths of loyalty to the crown. Why would he place himself in such danger, when the safer course of action would have been to stand back and watch John fall? Well, he secured the freedom of his sons William and Richard from John's clutches, and surely that was an important consideration. But he then threw himself fully behind John, winning ever more of the royal favour he had lost. When John found himself with so few friends, he richly rewarded those that remained. John launched an invasion of Normandy in 1213, when the English army was defeated in a pitched battle at Bouvines. William was not there. he was left to guard against opportunist attacks by the unruly Welsh. But the defeat was so devastating that John's position was weakened still further and rebellion spread across England. Factions coalesced around the king and his enemies, and a full-scale civil war brewed. The Marshal was heavily involved in the negotiations to avoid all-out conflict, and this resulted in 63 articles being drawn up by the rebellious barons. These were 63 demands that John would have to agree to in order to keep his kingdom. This is the document, signed in 1215, that would eventually become known as the Great Charter, or Magna Carta. No one was quite happy with this arrangement, least of all John, and soon he was attacking the rebels anyway, using Flemish mercenaries to cut a swathe of destruction through their lands. As you might expect, this only escalated things further, and soon the English barons were appealing to Philip II, going as far as offering the crown of England to his son Prince Louis in exchange for military support. The French, led by Louis, launched an invasion of the southeast of England in 1216, and Louis was soon declared king in London. Much of England was now conquered by foreign soldiers and in open rebellion against the king. And by autumn, King John was dead of a bloody flux, and the kingdom was ready to fall. But now would come William's finest hour. The Marshal had, for much of this war, been busy dealing with the rampaging Welsh, but now he had a decision to make. Would he go over to King Louis of England, the man of immense wealth and power, now in control of much of the country? Or would he back the 9-year-old child Henry, the pious son of the dead King John? William was about 69 years old at this point. He had climbed to become one of the leading men of the kingdom, famous across Christendom for his skill at arms and his unswerving loyalty. To choose to support Henry would mean choosing almost certain defeat, and all his lands and titles would be lost, and the prospects of his sons and daughters would be dashed. Most men would have made the rational choice. But what makes the Marshal into one of the greatest knights who ever lived is that he repeatedly chose to serve higher ideals over material gain. Never in his life had he turned his back on a lord or a king, and once again towards the end of his life he chose to honour his chivalric ideals and swore to protect the young Henry. The biographer relates the moment that William took possession of the boy. "Welcome, sir," young Henry said. "I entrust myself to God and to you, praying you in God's name to care for me, and may the true God, who bestows all blessings, grant that you manage our affairs successfully and keep us safe." "My dear lord," the Marshal said to the small child, "I faithfully swear upon my soul, as long as I am able, I shall be your loyal servant and ever mindful of your safety." Both the Marshal and the boy, and all those around them, were moved to tears. It must have all seemed so hopeless, and yet William wasted not a moment in rushing Henry to be crowned at Gloucester. The meagre royalist forces fell gratefully in behind his authority as guardian of the realm. His strategies for winning back the kingdom were not just military but political. He reissued Magna Carta, and through his generosity and leniency brought over as many lords as he could to the boy king. He also liquidated the crown's jewels and raised as much cash as possible to fund the forces in the field. But he could not keep the war going for long, so he sought to gamble on a grand engagement to decide matters one way or the other, once and for all. In 1217, now aged 70, William Marshal drew up his army in the centre of England and looked for his battle. Prince Louis sent half his army to attack the great castle at Dover, while the rest he sent north, where they took the important royalist town of Lincoln. Summoning all his strength, Marshal led his army in an attack on forces within the town. Sending a diversionary force of crossbowmen to scale the walls, one of the gates was breached and the Marshal's army surged into the town. William led the charge from the front, racing down the streets on his warhorse and plunging deep into the rows of enemy knights. The fighting was bloody and brutal, with hundreds of men and horses pressed into the tight confines of the streets, with arrows raining down from above. The French were pressed back into the square before Lincoln Cathedral, where William fought the enemy commander Count Thomas of Perche in combat, William taking a series of blows to the head, his helmet badly dented. Another knight killed the Count, and the French and rebel forces broke, fleeing in panic through the south gate. They were pursued across the country, and most were butchered as they fled or were taken prisoner, while only 200 knights escaped. This incredible victory caused a shocked Louis to give up his siege of Dover and start negotiations, while at the same time he sent for reinforcements from France. This reinforcement fleet was caught by the English off Sandwich and destroyed. Prince Louis's attempt to conquer England had failed, and the rebel barons fled his side and came over to Henry III. Louis fled with his tail between his legs, encouraged to go without delay by a generous payment. Against all the odds, the guardian of the realm had succeeded in saving it, and secured the crown for the boy king Henry III. The landless younger son of a middling noble had risen to become the effective ruler of England, and for a year and a half he continued to work tirelessly to stabilise the realm. But his immense efforts took their toll, and in 1219 he fell ill and retired to his bed. As his energy drained away over the coming weeks, he was surrounded by his loving wife and children and his faithful household retinue, and he set his affairs in order, seeing to his mighty inheritance and the security of his children and his men. In his last days, he divulged his secret agreement with the Knights Templar. Decades before, in the 1180s, he had decided to join that order before his death and wished to receive a burial at their hands. And in May 1219, he quietly passed away with his family around him. His body was taken to London, where a large crowd of barons escorted him to Westminster Abbey for a vigil and a mass before he was finally laid to rest in Temple Church. In his funeral oration, Archbishop Stephen Langton described William Marshal as the greatest knight to be found in all the world. He left his household in a magnificent position, and he would have been sure that his line would have gone on for generations as one of the most powerful families in England. Unfortunately, none of his 5 sons were able to father an heir, so the male line was extinguished after just 1 generation. However, his son William engaged a writer to record the narrative of his father's extraordinary life, based on written evidence and the stories of the men who knew him. This is the first known biography of a medieval knight, and this remarkable legacy provides a unique insight into the period and into one of the most remarkable men of the era. William Marshal was a man of enormous ambition, incredible skill in battle and politics, and a virtuous knight who sought always to live up to the chivalric ideals of his age. Thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel. If you enjoy my videos, please do subscribe on Patreon to ensure I can keep making them in future. Now, please watch this video on the life of Richard the Lionheart and check out my medieval history playlist for more amazing stories like this one. Thank you for watching.